And Dorothy Gillespie is a beloved artist and a Roanoke native, born in Roanoke in 1920. And while she lived most of her life in New York, she traveled extensively through the U.S. And since Dorothy passed in 2012, Gary has really assumed the ownership of his mother's legacy, as we will see this evening, and as well as these exhibitions as they commemorate her the 2020 and what would have been that 100 years. And although she was a working artist and a mentor, as Gary always says, she was not a self-promoter. So that's something that, through these exhibitions throughout the country, she continues that art and legacy of Dorothy Gillespie. So if you haven't seen the exhibitions yet, we have the Celestial Centennial, the Art and Legacy of Dorothy Gillespie, and that will be up until September 13th, so 2 more weekends. We're open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays here at the Taubman. And then Dorothy Gillespie Still Enchanting Virginia's Blue Ridge.
Now, the significance of champagne, not champagne, is that, of course, the nightclub where they owned in 1946 was called that. And it was a very famous nightclub. Some of the guests that were there were Cary Grant, Shelley Winters, John Carradine, Marlon Brando, Lucille Ball, Archduke Franz Joseph, Zero Mostel, Charlie Chaplin, Judy Holliday, Harry Belafonte, Tony Bennett. I remember my father always saying he tried to get Tony Bennett to sing because that's the type of nightclub it was. It was a cabaret. And Tony Bennett would say to my father, "I can't. They won't let me sing unless I have a contract with you." So in the 40s, early 50s, the mob basically controlled Tony Bennett, and so they wouldn't let him perform unless he was getting paid. And the type of nightclub it was described as a combination art gallery, cocktail lounge, and nightclub, a place where young artists exhibit and sell their works without commission to the gallery. A cocktail lounge where young actors and actresses who pound the pavement from agent to agent during the day work as bartenders and waitresses at night. An informal nightclub where impromptu style, talented guests and waitresses use club patrons as a sounding board for fresh, new musical skits, sketches, and songs. So in 1946, my mother did the self-portrait. That was also the year that that my father proposed to my mother. And the proposal was on one condition: no children. And we know how that worked out since there were 3 children. But that was not a problem for my mother, because she went to my father after they got married and brought up the possibility of having a child, just a child, because remember back then in the 40s, women artists were certainly not having children and maybe not even getting married. And if they got married, it was usually to an artist. Well, she said to my father, "Bernard, Bunny, I promise you that if we have a child, that child will never interfere in our lives." And my mother kept that promise. She and my father lived a life that was extraordinary. And I remember at the end, my mother said, "Gary, I don't know how your life was, but mine was wonderful." And I said, "Mom, I was in the back seat of the car. I saw the life that they had. They would get dressed up every night, go to the nightclub, the one in Florida, then again, when we moved back to New York City. And so they lived this extraordinary life." He played the clarinet. My mother was an artist during the day. And then at night, and you can see in that picture from the nightclub, my mother's self-portrait on the left, my father's on the right. And the entertainers would come in, and that's the portrait. And what's significant, I don't know if you can see it there on the screen, but it's signed Gillespie, Israel. Well, that's significant, of course, because that's the year she got married. And she was so proud, excited to marry this man 10 years older, previously married with 2 children. And So she signed at Gillespie, Israel in 1946. And that was basically the year she became a feminist, because after that, she never used my father's name. It always was Gillespie. So that was significant. She was proud. She was excited being married. But then she said, why should I give my husband credit?
Well, and we can see from that, that image that we showed on the screen with the nightclub and that vibrancy too. It feels like you could be there. And that was in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and the Greenwich Village, correct?
Greenwich Village. Now,
Greenwich Village, yes.
There are many, many artists, Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock, Louise Nevelson, all those artists are down there. So my mother is, during the day, she's creating her art. And then at night, she is being the hostess in the nightclub, and my father's playing the clarinet. And they did that until 1951, and then we moved first to Peru and then to Florida. And I'll show you some of the artwork from both.
And that's a great segue into the art that she created in the 50s and early 60s, that abstract expressionism. And we have two on view right now, larger ones in that time frame, one in our permanent collection and then on exhibition. So, why the move to South Florida?
Well, we first went to Peru for 2 years. I was born in 1949, and my sister was born in 47. So I don't remember Peru because I was only 2 years old. Then it was time to come back to the States. And my mother decided she wanted to create art anonymously. She always believed that. And that's why she never wanted to be famous. That was not important. She wanted anonymity. That was more important, because she always said, if your persona gets in front of your art, it interferes with it. So when people say, oh, your mother wasn't famous, she could have been famous, that was not who my mother was. This is an early, and I love her early works. And unfortunately, there aren't many left. They're out. My mother didn't believe in keeping them in the studio. She always wanted them to be, in someone's home or in a museum.
You've been working on Dorothy's legacy for many years, correct, Gary?
Well, after my mother passed away, you have all this art. And one of the things that I am doing is speaking to artists and children of artists to plan what they need to do, because when my mother passed away, I have a brother and sister who wanted nothing to do with the art, and I had no instructions, no directions. And so what do? Well, what children usually do is they want to sell the art, and that would be the last thing I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was basically go out and see where my mother's art was and talk to Bill White, Eric Fitzpatrick, two of the first artists that I've met. And since then, I've met countless artists and museum directors and curators. So I wanted to basically learn about the art world, because my mother left her children out of the art world. And after 8 years, I could see in a way why, because it is tiring, but it's also exciting, exhilarating. And I've learned so much from going into artist studios and meeting with curators and museum directors. And so 8 years later, actually 8 years ago, you couldn't even come into the studio here because it became a storage area. So this is another darker, it's sort of abstract. I mean, it's abstract, but you could see mountains. You can still see what you want. And one of the reasons my mother went into abstract, and you'll see some of her early drawings from art school a little later, and you'll say, well, whoa, why didn't she stay with portraits? She loved to do portraits. Or why didn't she stay with realism? Well, she said there had been enough fruits and vegetables and landscapes done. So one more, what's the purpose? So here she's leaving it up to the viewer to see what they want to see in it, and not tell them what it is. Next one.
And I know you have your canvas boxes that she did as well.
Oh, yes. And I'll take you over there. Okay, so these are cubes. This is from the 50s. I remember these in Miami, in Florida. And what's interesting is she painted on, this is wood, and this is canvas. And so if you think about the paintings, she's now starting to get into the three-dimensional, starting to get into let the viewer be part of the space. That was important for her, to have it come off the wall. And so you can change. So as a kid, this was sort of fun to play with. And my mother always had studios, as I said, all around the country. But sometime when we were making that move, especially from Florida to New York in 1963, she turned our dining room into a studio. And so a studio was always very important to her and very important to artists. And now for me, of course, a studio is vital. But a studio is someplace where you can escape and do your work. So her advice to young artists was always have a studio. Even if it's a closet, you need a place to go to.
Well, I think that's fabulous advice. And you know, as we look through this studio, we can just see the amount of work that, you know, she created and, you know, like you described, created on a daily basis. And do you even have a count? I know you find different things every day, but one of the questions that came up was, you know, how many portraits, how many works, how many, you know, has she created over the years?
Well, as you can see, there are a lot of portraits in the back. Radford University has the largest collection of portraits. So she would go from one medium to another. And one of the reasons why she didn't want to be represented by the gallery is because the gallery would tell her what sells. The gallery would say to Jackson Pollock, this is what they want. And my mother in the 40s and 50s, and in Florida in the 60s, she didn't want anyone telling her what to do. I mean, this was the time of the 60s when we moved to New York. This is a flag show. She also had other types of happenings, the American Way of Death, and that was about with coffins and the cost of dying. And, you know, I'm 16 years old. Actually, I'm 14 years old. And here, most parents, mothers are baking cookies for their kids. And my mother is doing this exhibition of coffins. But then in 1966, she did this patriotic show. It was called the Flag Show. And I couldn't have been more proud because I remember the Sunday Times article and I'm going, wow, how cool is it? And so this flag show was in the Times and was described as flag is subject of an art show. Sunday Review by Alfred Clark said, quote, a modern day Betsy Ross named Dorothy Gillespie figured that she had cut, snipped, shaped, and painted about 3,500 stars of mylar.
Oh, interesting. Mylar. Yeah. And I think you found another piece of hers with mylar on paper. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, what's fascinating is, and I do learn these things, I found this 1966. This is the same year as the flag show. And what's unusual is it's metal. And I don't think anyone knows. I mean, I now know that she was doing metal as early as 1966 because her first outdoor metal show was in the mid-70s. She was experimenting with mylar. In 1964, I remember we went to the World's Fair, New York World's Fair, and they had mylar. And she was so fascinated with it that she started to use it. This is 1968.
Oh, wow.
1968. And I think we'll go over here to the paper.
Yeah, and you know, I have a favorite quote I'd love to share from Dorothy, Gary, and She said changes in style do not occur overnight, but in little increments. And I think that's a kind of a perfect time to share that, because we see that, you know, in her work that you're sharing right now with that Mylar, and now you're going to the paper, which then is kind of that precursor to, you know, her hallmark style.
Well, in 1976, she had a big show at New York, NYU, and it was paper, and hundreds of feet of paper. So I still have some, I found.
Well, and we have a number of the paperworks in the exhibitions right now, and I think that is instrumental in seeing that experimental, you know, vision of hers.
Yeah, exactly, because the paper that you have, oh, there it is. That's in a museum, cascading, you know, hundreds of feet of paper. Very inexpensive to produce, cheap to ship, but they don't last long. So she was starting to think about how to involve the viewer and yet keep it where it will last. And so she's starting to think about the metal. And so these are paper tubes.
Well, and this other second image that we're showing shows the, you know, a sheet of the sheet, but also that style of the paper coming cascading down over also on the side that looks very much like the metal work.
Yes, and this is the paper with the Mylar. This is still before her doing the metal sculptures. Paper. And then I discovered this, which is paper that is on metal.
Oh, interesting. That's a step I haven't seen yet.
Whoa.
And did you just find this, Gary?
I just found these, and I'm going, wait. So I started to peel, just to see. And I'm saying, how did she do that? And so much work to do that. My plan is to have a show, paper show. And I think I have enough to do that with all these. This is another piece.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. And Joe's comment was that, you know, it really creates a silhouette in the background, that paper. So, in the projection part of it. So beautiful.
Now, do you hear this?
Yes.
Why my mother did this, I don't know, because she always felt, and maybe that's why she started to use aluminum, because this small piece is very heavy. But if you look closely, I don't know if you can see it, it's canvas on metal. So she went from the paper on the metal to canvas on the metal. But it was steel, which is crazy because she can't do it without help. So she did very few of these, and then eventually went to the aluminum, which you can see, of course, all around.
Yeah, I see that, you know, I think we all recognize the starburst. And I did a placement in my office. I have a starburst behind me, you know, which is part of our sharing collection, as well as what we have. Oh, this is beautiful. We're looking at the Harvest family. Now we're looking at Melrose Library, where the tall sculptures, you know, thank you for giving that to our community and being able to share it with those, you know, every day, the children and families coming into the library.
Well, art should be seen. My mother loved to do public art, and that's one of the things that I am doing, and I'm so excited about. Actually, I'm sharing this news. No one knows this news now, but next June in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Flower Show, many of the pieces that you see in here and pieces from the Rockefeller Center show will be on exhibit at the Flower Show.
How exciting. That is great news.
Well, they told me only 400,000 people see it. So and there'll be directors of outdoor gardens, arboretums, botanical gardens will be there. And so the director of the flower show said, Gary, from here, from Philadelphia, it's an opportunity for it to go around the country. And I want it to go around the country. I don't want it to come back here. And my goal before I die would be to have all this art out in the public as much as possible. And so to that fact, what I'm doing is donating art to hospitals, to places that have work with disabled people, libraries, of course, because the art should be seen. This is maquettes. And so I thought this would be interesting to show. There was a screen share. This my mother did large pieces, of course. This is at Radford University.
Right. And I think that's a great combo as you show the maquettes and then we see on the wall. And this is one of your assistants who graduate from Radford University, but also was an intern here at the museum and continues to work for you, which is wonderful to see that, that support of young professionals in the area and continuing, their career path. And I know education was a key component of your mother's legacy and that mentorship, the scholarships, internships that you continue.
Well, yes, and Dalen was actually the first student to have an internship. That was a couple of years ago, and since then we've had students. I've had students from JMU, students from down in Birmingham, Alabama, and this summer we were going to have other students, but of course with the pandemic it just couldn't happen.
Right. So yeah. love that connection and seeing, I think, artist process, the maquette to the actual, and they're big sculptures. Gary, talk a little bit about that and your mother. I know, that work that she did herself.
Well, this piece was in Orlando, and then 2003 was destroyed by a hurricane. It's 62 feet high, 10,000 rivets, 92 panels, and instead of my mother repairing it, she decided to cut it up, and it's now 720 starbursts in the same location. So she always said to me, Gary, I have to produce big things. And this is back in the 60s, 50s down in Florida. Her abstract paintings were so much larger than what I showed. I remember her being on a ladder painting them. So big was always important. And I remember when she did the wall, public wall in downtown Houston Street, and someone came over to her and asked who did that. And my mother said, I did it. And he looked at her and he said, no, a woman couldn't do that. That was a very important time date-wise, because my mother realized that from then on, she could not just sign her work Gillespie. So all the works that you've seen, you can date them by the signature. If it's signed Gillespie or D. Gillespie, it was before 1976. After 1976, she insisted on signing everything Dorothy Gillespie, so the viewer would know that a woman did it. And she always gave that advice to artists, women artists: use your maiden name and always use your first name, so that men and women know that you're a woman who created it. So these maquettes, this was on the wall of the museum in Fort Lauderdale. And then you could see she would always do a maquette beforehand.
Oh, yes.
And not only for these big pieces, but for a collector's home. As I traveled around the country and I met countless, maybe hundreds of collectors, they would say to me, your mother would come out, look at the space, go back to her New York City studio and create the work, and then come out. And I go, how did she have the time to travel and still produce the amount of work? And I realized she traveled to more than 40 universities. I've established scholarships in 14 of those.
Amazing.
She spent as much time out of the studio as she did in, maybe even more. And I remember a friend saying he knew George O'Keeffe. He says, George O'Keeffe would spend days locked in her studio, literally locked in her studio. And your mother was the opposite. So my mother, and I think it gets back to her early days in the nightclub in Florida and New York, needing to be around people. That's where she got her energy.
Well, I think we saw that in some of those images, and I think any of the photos that we see of Dorothy really is that energy that seems like was, like you said, drawn from people. And Gary, can you adjust your screen a little bit? Then we can see you as well. I know you're highlighting your mother's work, but then we can see you as you speak. So.
You see
yes.
Starburst. Yeah, I can't wait for the flower show because the director says, Gary, I want Starburst. I said, where are you going to hang them? We're going to hang them in the trees. And you can see a couple of the totems.
Oh, and those are some of the ones that were at the Rockefeller. Is that correct?
Right. I kept 2 here. There are 5 that are down in Wilmington. So these 2 will join the 5 in Philadelphia next year. And I have some more little totems that will join them. And this is one that I'm really excited to showcase. And the intricacy that you see here, and the fact that each piece has been bent by hand, and my mother didn't use gloves, and she used rivets. As I said, her nickname was Dorothy the Riveter. In addition to be, the Wizard of Art, she loved to use the rivet gun. I'm just sorry she didn't use those skills in the kitchen and make her children dinner. But that's another story.
Well, and I know you want to show us, as we go around the studio and go to the workspace to round out the tour, and the drawers where, you've kept her work from art school. Let's move into that section, because this is part of the studio, but this is kind of that workspace, so we can see, that continuum.
Okay. When I had to move the studio, okay, this is my mother in art school. Okay. And what a treat it was to see her early works. You look at this and you say, wait a second, why didn't she stay doing this? And
that's some beautiful works. And those are those pastel?
Yes, these are pastel.
Right?
These are pastels. And it just...
And I know, once you inherited and you were going through the studio, there's so many works that you discovered, and I'm amazed because you discover things daily.
Well, I do. I mean, look, this ink on paper. I mean, this is from the 50s, and the number that I find here in the pastels, and this is from 1975. So she's starting to, you could tell the period of time. The darker colors and more vibrant. And this is during that time, brighter colors.
Well, I'm just thinking, a lot of intern work here for cataloging, and it goes back to one of the first questions from those on the call, wondering, how many works are even in the collection, but that's hard to, I think, probably name at this point.
Well, JF and I are going to be up here for 3 days, and we're going to tackle these drawers. Now, you have to understand, these drawers were in New York City, along with other file cabinets with all her documents, all the letters, brochures, flyers, catalogs. Those are now at Rutgers University, safe and sound. And I want to do this. And oh, by the way, they're being digitized. The Dorothy M. Gillespie Foundation is,
wonderful.
Is sponsoring for them to be digitized, because right now artists have to go to Rutgers, to go to my mother's files, to review them, to study them. But once they're digitized, any artist from around the country or the world will be able to do research on my mother. I did find this recently. And I thought this was cute. This is during the summer that my mother would be in art school. she would say that she would make extra money by going to Atlantic City, the boardwalk, and tips accepted for sketches. She loved to do sketches of people. That was interesting. But getting back to, my mother could have done portraits her whole life, but that's not who she was. She liked to try different things. And in the very later life, towards the end of her life, she started to do these, and lots of them, hundreds of these. And I remember she would say, Gary, go to the store, I need more Sharpies. This is what Sharpies are. And she would do big ones, and then she was doing these. And so we'll be inventorying these, but there are hundreds of those. So energy level, I mean, I get up at 4:30, but she must have gotten up earlier than that.
Well, and I think, one of the comments in the chat forum was, did she ever sleep? Because, just looking at the amount of work and hearing, even just, the night, her earlier days with your father in New York, and then, her continuum of, really that part of the university ties and the education, but then creating work. So, doesn't seem there was a lot of sleep, right?
Well, I remember when we moved back to New York in 1963, she would go to the nightclub at night, and it was called the Champagne Gallery then. When they bought it back in 1963, it was called the Champagne Gallery. So she would go there, work till 3, 4 o'clock. I would hear her coming home, and she'd get up and make my younger brother breakfast, and then see him off to school. And then she'd go to the studio and work. So she didn't need much sleep, maybe 5, 6 hours ways.
Yeah.
This is something she did at the very end, and I'm so thankful she signed them. They're puzzles. She would say, go out and get me blank puzzles and different sizes, and
fabulous. I haven't seen these either, Gary.
Oh, no. And I framed a couple of them, and you know what? They're pretty cool.
That I agree. Well, that just reminds me of, that art and legacy of Dorothy Gillespie, and, the celebration that's happening across the country in 2020 and beyond. And so we'll love to show a couple of images from the exhibition, because that really, is part of that celebration. So thank you for sharing Dorothy. And this is the proclamation with Joe Cobb, Vice Mayor Joe Cobb, as it was presented in the gallery. And you can see Dorothy's work behind us, and the year of color, light, and motion. And, proclamation for, it was respected to American artist and sculptor Dorothy Gillespie, and that centennial year. So, and that's hanging up in the gallery as well. And so it was really exciting to have that happen in Roanoke with the city this year.
Yeah, so during the 70s, people know that my mother was quite involved with the women's. And so she had all the artists that she knew do sketchbooks. And so, of course, I have copies of the sketchbook, Betty Parsons and Audrey Flack and Elaine de Kooning. And so I recently found this sketchbook that Elaine Kooning did. And she gave it to my mother, and it's dated 1976, and it's great. I mean, but these are the things I find, and whenever I come to the studio, I'm more inspired by finding things that I never knew existed. So I found this recently. So during the 70s, my mother did this. I didn't know this. This could have been on her resume. She did crossword puzzles, women's art movement crossword puzzles. And then on the back, Art World Maze by Dorothy Gillespie. And so you would go, depending on the number, you've been the gallery route, and now you know that the art galleries show 90% men and 10% women. And number two, the museums. On this path, you have found that museums have less than 10% women artists. Congratulations, you're the token woman artist. So I just discovered that. And
well, I think Dorothy really blazed the path for women artists in the 70s, and that I think accentuates that.
Well, and I found that out by traveling around the country and meeting with artists that would tell me that. And so they were helping me fill in the blanks, sort of complete the puzzle. And one of the things that we'll be announcing is the film project titled Discovering Dorothy Gillespie, and just meeting all those people that knew my mother and having them on this film will really share so much more information that people just didn't know, because you had said she wasn't a self-promoter, and that's, boy, is that an understatement. Yeah, she just never, it happened. I mean, she's in a lot of newspaper articles, but she didn't have a PR person, so it wasn't important to her.